Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. It's time for yet another episode of Progressive Profiles, and today we have arguably one of the more present on social media guests we've had, which is Mike Figueredo of the Humanist Report. So, yes, hi, Mike. And quick
How are you
question
doing?
to start is, why is it called the Humanist Report, and why did you start it?
The Humanist Report, admittedly, is a very lame placeholder name that I just kept because I was not very creative. When I was considering starting a podcast or a YouTube show, it was really just an idea that I played with that I wasn't really serious about, and I created a couple of logos, just Humanist Report as like a I'm a humanist back then. Um, that was kind of something that I think was more salient to me, humanism and atheism, and trying to use like our own intelligence as a species to guide us. So I thought Humanist Report. I don't think that's taken. So I created some logos, and then it just kind of it stuck. And then it's like, well, I probably should come up with a better name, and I couldn't. So I kept the Humanist Report. And the whole reason why I started the show honestly was not to have like a giant platform. At best, I was hoping to get like a small community out of it and meet some people, but I really just wanted speaking experience because that was about a year or two before I'd be teaching. And I was horrified because I was more of a writer, never a speaker. So I wasn't really sure about my skills as an orator. So I thought, look, if I put myself on YouTube, people are going to be ruthless. But
Yeah.
within the hate, there's going to be some kernels of truth. And I think that even watching myself, I can kind of learn and reflect from that. But, I started talking about things that people liked, and it just kind of kicked off. I think that part of it was a perfect storm. I got lucky. I was talking about Bernie Sanders during an
Right. Yeah.
election, and that's when people are very, very active online and
And that was
politically
actually how I
engaged.
first started hearing about you in the first place, back around
Oh,
that time
really?
of the candidacy. Yeah.
No
And then
kidding.
it was actually you were further solidified by Lance of the Serfs, because he had shown some videos of yours as well. And I think maybe you two were on a panel or something. I forget exactly.
Oh,
Which said,
very
oh, okay,
cool.
I'm seeing a little bit more about this Mike guy from the Humanist Report. All right, I'm going to look into that later. And here we are, like several years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, now, I don't know what year we're on. We're like year 8, I think. As of June, I'll be doing this for 8 years. But yeah, it really wasn't something that I took super serious. And in fact, like a month before I was supposed to launch the show, when I was out of school for summer, I wasn't gonna do it. I was just like, what's the point? And my husband actually convinced me, yeah, give it a try. You might like doing it. It might be cathartic, and you might actually learn something from it. So I did. Like he actually talked me back into starting it.
Wow.
Otherwise,
Okay.
I was like, so I almost just didn't do it because it's like in this day and age, I think that we need more people to kind of put their voices out there, but like what more can I contribute to the conversation? There's already other folks like, Kyle Kalinske at the time and David Packman and the Young Turks. The problem is that like I felt like I did have something unique because I would watch them and I would yell at my screen and I'd be like, no, add this, but also this. Like I'm having a
Oh,
conversation with
oh, hey,
them.
that's me. Hi, yes, I'm just ranting
Right.
into the void. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So rather than screaming into the ether and talking like my friends and my partner's ear off about politics, which they were not interested in, I thought, no, I think it will be a good little outlet for me. If anything, maybe I'll learn some public speaking skills. Maybe I'll learn a little bit about myself. But there's really nothing to lose at this point. Why not? So yeah.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And also, I guess a word of wisdom to all who are watching or listening is listen to your husbands, because
Yeah.
like that was apparently a really good call. And
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding.
I'm also glad that you mentioned the Young Turks, because isn't there like some connection between you and this show and the Young Turks? Like someone platformed it or something like that.
So I joined TYT Network back in 2017.
Okay, that's
Um,
what I'm thinking of then. Okay.
and I don't know, I don't even know if they have a traditional network in the sense of YouTube networks, but I'm still,
It's a gray area, yeah.
Yeah, they don't really advertise it anymore, but I am under their MC, like they're my MCN, my multi-channel network partner. So since I'm not big enough to have my own YouTube representative, they kind of act as my representative online in the event I get deplatformed or something goes wrong. Although nowadays these aren't really necessary. Because you can kind of just talk directly to the YouTube creators on Twitter and they're pretty responsive. So I go to them before I go to TYT if there is an issue. But yeah, MCNs are kind of obsolete now. But I'm still with TYT in terms of them being my network partner. But yeah, every once in a while they'll invite me on the show. But for the most part, they're just there if anything goes wrong. Because, when you do this full time, you're essentially self-employed and
Mm.
there's no like boss to go to. There's no head department that you could
Yeah,
head that
there
like
isn't a
handles.
corporate tower with an address you can go see, right?
No, there's nothing. So like if something goes wrong, what do you do? And at the time that I joined them, I was really worried because I almost lost my platform because of CBS. I played a 30-second clip of a Trump interview, which I think is kind of important. It's also fair use, so it's perfectly legal. And their legal team came after me hard, and it was
Uh,
like, we'll take you to court. And at that time, I can't. I mean, I still, if I were to be uh, in that situation, I don't have money to defend myself in court. I'd have to acquiesce. So it was a little bit frightening.
yeah, that's also one of the problems I have with the legal system in general is, oh, hey, if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided to you. And it's like, great, that doesn't account for everything else about the legal system, which should be free at point of use. Just like
Yeah.
gonna put that right out there.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's something that I know I haven't really mentioned too much, but it's something that just kind of irks me that I wish more people kind of thought about and realized, oh, hey, maybe that's a problem when corporations with massive amounts of money and an actual legal department, a team of well-paid lawyers can come after just some average person who's not going to have the wherewithal to be able to defend themselves. That's an unequal system. So much for justice and equality. I wish more people thought
Right.
about that.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
with that
Because
though, this isn't meant to be like me ranting about everything. I do want
no,
want
that's great.
want to ask some more questions about how this started, and also you'd mentioned Bernie Sanders and sort of covering him and the various other candidates as well. I think you also interviewed Andrew Yang at one point,
Hmm.
which I know you caught some flack for.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like, what is YouTube without flack, right? But one
Yeah.
thing that I did want to talk to you about was that you apparently worked for the Human Rights Campaign to defeat "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," the now outdated military policy of
Hmm.
what was known as gays in the military. So, how and why did that become a crucial kind of cause that you really cared about, and also how did you get so deeply involved in that?
Yeah, so I don't want to overstate my presence with them. I did a little bit of canvassing for them to raise money for that, and I didn't work directly with HRC, but I worked with a different company that they basically contract with different organizations for these types of things. So when I was hired by them, it was a secondary job, and they were contracting currently with the Human Rights Campaign. And I specifically wanted to work with them just so I could help with that issue, but I didn't do it for very long. But the reason why that was so important wasn't necessarily because I had like any experience in the military, but it was because it was a very winnable issue. It was an issue that at the time we couldn't get marriage equality, but one thing that we could get in terms of a dub for the LGBTQ plus community was ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I felt like focusing our effort on that made a lot of sense. And prior to that, I did a lot of like online activism, otherwise known as slacktivism, where I sent out petitions and
Yep.
sent some messages and stuff to lawmakers. But yeah, I won't say that I did a ton of stuff. I raised like maybe a couple of $100 for that effort over the span of like a few days, but it wasn't a lot. But I was very active online in terms of like trying to figure out what's the next best step. And the Human Rights Campaign, even then, really frustrated me because they always took like this very pro status quo approach, like don't overturn the apple cart, let's not push too hard for marriage equality. And that really frustrated me because I felt like I don't like this idea of having to wait until it's like appropriate or it feels right. I think that you fight for justice now. Now is a good time. So my whole like admiration for these types of organizations, even though our interests technically aligned, it didn't last very long because that was when like I started to realize like there's a difference between like these very grassroots organizers and these massive organizations that are basically part of the establishment.
Yeah, yeah. You're pretty much preaching to the choir because that's me and my main political party here in Canada. And again, a lot of larger charities and organizations where it's all, whoa, yeah, can't ruffle too many feathers. And I'm just like, so nothing good has ever come from trying to meet the opposition on their terms. You have to
Mm-hmm.
kind of force enough of a fight or a conflict to the point that someone has to say, okay, fine, what can we give you so that things can settle down for all our benefit? The right
Mm-hmm.
does this a lot. It's why they tend to win a lot of things because they make a lot of noise, and that spooks the status quo establishment who says, oh, whoa, okay, yeah, sure, fine, here, we'll not raise your municipal taxes, even though that's going to hurt you and the everyone who lives in your city. But there you go. Hey, fine. Like it, that's
Mm-hmm.
always so deeply frustrating to hear. Hey, I know you may care very deeply about this issue that is an issue of equality and injustice, but we got to be sure that we're not making mom and pop shops in the suburbs too angry and suddenly turned off of this idea. I'm like, what do you hear yourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Do you
It's
hear
deeply
yourselves as you're trying to
frustrating.
say, no, 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 we have to be gentle with oppressors? Like, what?
Yeah.
It's absolutely wild. So if you can't tell, I've always been like this.
That's good. That's good though.
Yeah, and I very much have my parents to blame. A story that I like to tell sometimes, and mention in passing with a few videos, is that at one point my mom was going to a lot of meetings to try and help save the French immersion program here in Ontario. Because back in the 90s it was under threat because, oh, look, a conservative is in charge. They're trying to cut costs and, oh, come on, French ain't that useful here in this province. And so, there's little old me like, why does mom have to go to all these meetings all the time? And she's like, well, sweetie, it's because people want to take away your education. And that taught me from a very young age of, oh, so I could just be minding my own business and someone's going to try and mess with my life. Interesting. And then that kind of just started the road to radicalization. And I think,
That's a really cool origin story. That's awesome that your parents explained that to you and whatnot.
well, that was like my mom starting with that, but again, it was like in kind of kid friendly terms.
Hmm.
And then there's my dad, who's basically he's got like it's kind of funny seeing my mom and dad. They're very different people, and it's
Mm.
part of why they're no longer together, although they do still love and care for each other. Um, but there's my dad, like this long haired black Rasta man, and he's always been very kind of more spiritual, but also free and liberated in that sense. So even though he believes in God, he never forced me to believe or follow in that. It's like, well, son, what do you think? How do you view these things? This is your personal journey to find, whether you believe in God or not. And my mom kind of had the same view of, well, here's what I believe. The rest is up to you. So growing up in that very liberal and very progressive kind of environment obviously meant that I was going to be a pretty progressive and like left leaning kind of dude. My mom was part of the original hippie movement, stuff like that. So yeah, I just grew up with lots of stuff that I just, in many ways, I guess, took for granted as a kid. And only now
Hmm.
with retrospect do I realize, oh, A, those are very important lessons. And B, those are things that I'm very glad I learned and then could teach other people about.
Hmm.
Um, but that does also remind me that I think you said somewhere that your parents were also very influential in developing your activist mindset. So when did that first start for you?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that they helped me to like develop an activist type mindset. I think that they they helped me to see the world from like the outsider perspective,
Okay.
because they were always very, like my dad in particular was always really anti-establishment, and whoever was in power, he hated them, and he kind of oscillated back and forth between being conservative and being pretty liberal. um Although I tried to radicalize him towards the end of his life as much as I could, but like he, initially was fine with Clinton, then hated Clinton after the welfare reform bill, which, it hit my family pretty hard. And I just remember him watching the news and seething. And then he supported George W. Bush enthusiastically. They went through a very strong evangelical phase, took us to church every single Sunday and Wednesday. But then Bush decided to invade Iraq. And my dad was not happy about that because my dad is a veteran. So he was very anti war. And then when it came to Obama, I remember him and I together, we cried watching the historic election. Wow, this is the first black president.
Yeah,
I
like
can't believe we've seen this in our
history,
lifetimes.
right? Yeah.
Like, yeah, so I'll always remember that moment with my dad, only to a couple years later debate him about the Affordable Care Act, where he was really skeptical, kind of from this right-wing perspective, whereas I was skeptical from a left-wing perspective because I really wanted a single payer or a public option.
Yeah.
But a single payer didn't necessarily seem like it was on the table because I was very lib-brained back then. I didn't think, well, why can't they just fight for it? So for me, I thought, well, what's within the realm of possibility? A public option. So I wanted that. So, we kind of debate that, but ultimately he ended up supporting Bernie because I brainwashed him and I forced him to and told him Bernie was amazing. He also really liked Bernie just because he was like, my family was very poor. So any politician that really tailored their agenda towards working people and poor people, my parents were always smitten by them. So yeah, I kind of feel like, not necessarily like my anti-establishment streak, but kind of, it came from my dad because I feel like he was always, regardless of whether or not you start liking a politician, he kind of showed me that you don't have to unquestioningly support them forever. You don't have to be unapologetic about them. There can be caveats. You can criticize them, question everything. And that's kind of where I got that. And I almost think that there's like somewhat of a contrarian streak from my dad that he instilled in me. Not that I'm like necessarily known for being a contrarian, but like just this inherent skepticism about the system that I have. I do feel like that was rooted with my parents and their political instincts. But there's also a lot, as much as I credit them for like kind of shaping me to be a more empathetic person, there were some things that they got horribly, horribly wrong. But I felt like with time, they corrected that. So, yeah, your parents, I feel like they can't not influence you. So I do credit them for like the best elements of my identity and ideology.
That's actually fascinating to hear about your dad, because he does sound like that kind of political ideal of the swing voter, of going back and forth and like, oh, we like him at first and then, oh, that's it, I'm going to teach you a lesson in the midterms and vote for the other guy. Like, that sounds like your dad. And so now I'm just imagining America is really just full of people like your dad.
And he is the quintessential normie.
Goddamn normies everywhere. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is definitely a thing where we are influenced by our parents, which is why I've also never really bought into the idea that some people have that, racism and bigotry is dying out because, oh, all those people who have those beliefs are dying off. And I think, yeah, they're dying off, but they're also passing a lot of those beliefs on to the next generation. And then it's up to that generation of whether or not they break away from that. Plenty do, and that is good. That is a cause célèbre. But it also means that there are just as many people who are still racist, bigoted, homophobic. You name any kind of injustice, and they'll be for it if their parents and or their grandparents were also for it. And so it's just normalized in the household. So for me, again, growing up, it's like, oh, hey, eating a lot of vegetables because hippies, and actually having our own veggie garden, caring about the environment. Marijuana ain't that bad. I see my dad smoking it all the time. Like, these are things where it obviously became kind of normalized. And so I thought, this isn't bad. This isn't evil. And then, you look online, at least back in the early 2000s, and you have people saying, oh, these evil drug dealers and smoking their reefer and it's a danger. And I'm like, No, what? So it's one of those things where you are a product of your environment, and that goes for the good things that we were able to pull from our parents. It also goes for the bad things, whether that's generational trauma for indigenous people, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's outdated, racist, bigoted beliefs or toxic masculinity inherited from male figures in your life, be they your dads, older brothers, uncles, other cousins. So it's all connected and a part of it. And so I don't like that idea that you see sometimes of, oh, we don't need to worry. Demographic shift is leaning towards a blue wave. I'm like, yeah, but things can change, and people are still products of their environment, which again is part of why I'm a radical, because I want to address the things in people's environments that they don't have to struggle. They can get treatment options for substance abuse. Like all these different things are things that I actually care about.
Mm-hmm.
With that, though, um, I know that you've done a lot of activism and you have a great many causes that you care about. And even like some of the research and just watching your videos, it's kind of hard to pin down some of the really key ones that you care about. So, what would you say are maybe like, I don't know, what you can count on one hand, the big issues that you care about that motivate you to fight for a better world, regardless of who's in power? Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
Republicans, space aliens that come and take over the Earth. Like, what are like the 5 key issues for you that wake you up and energize you to fight every day?
Um, it's hard to narrow it down, and these
Right.
probably vary in salience. But I'll probably say number one has got to be climate change, just
All
because
right.
that that's it right there. If we can't figure that out, then as a species, we are completely existentially. So that's probably number one. Number two is trans rights, because I feel like we're on the cusp of a genocide in the United States, with the way in
Yeah.
which Republicans are operating. And I have friends, trans family members that I refuse to let inherit this world. Like I have young family members, and by the time they grow up, I want them to live in a world that is. I mean, I'm not going to be naive and say totally accepting, but at a minimum, at least less hostile. I think that that's achievable. So trans rights is huge to me right now. LGBTQ plus rights in general, but disproportionately, trans people are the targets of hate and bigotry currently. So that's kind of like
Yeah.
the focus. The next would be Medicare for all. Just because I'm an American and we have
You have my
one of the most
sympathies.
fucked up
Yep.
systems. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, every single month we have to pay hundreds of dollars to a health insurance provider, and we have no idea what they will or won't cover most of the time. Like
Yeah.
you really
It's
have to
it's
be
a
savvy.
minefield. It's
It's
it's unreal.
ridiculous. And when you think that you're covered, you're not. For example, I had a 15-minute conversation with my new primary care physician just to confirm, yes, I want to keep the same medication that I'm on. It's really helping me with anxiety. I thought that that was covered because it's just simple. Nope, $50 with insurance. So it's a really stupid, idiotic system. And Medicare for all would save lives and save money.
Yep.
And to support single payer in and of itself is a bit of a compromise for me, because I want a national healthcare system where every single hospital is nationalized and those doctors and nurses are they're working for the governments. I want to make sure that insurance companies just don't exist. So that's huge to me. It's always been one of my main issues. The problem is it's going to be one of the hardest things of our time if we can actually achieve Medicare for all,
Oh
because
yeah.
not only are insurance companies like leeches, but normal working people, they have investments in these companies. So, oh, well, my retirement can go up in flames if some of these companies that are part of my mutual funds, like insurance companies, if they go the way of the dodo. So it's really difficult. There's also the question of how do we transition the current insurance workers into the national health system. So it's complicated. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to fight for it, but that's probably number three. Number four would be racism, sexism, basically general social issues related to identity. I think that you can't really address racism and root it out unless you address it in a systemic way. Meaning you have to fundamentally change the system. This means offering reparations to Black Americans. This means um, trying to right the wrongs of the past by educating people. Also addressing any injustices against Indigenous people. So, like, general social issues is probably my next big issue. Next, I'd have to say worker rights. That's kind of a big umbrella term, but unionization. I believe that workers should own the means of production by law. I think that any company that has more than 10 employees should automatically be forced to convert to a worker-owned co-op, because that's literally the only way you can have economic justice. I'm part of a worker-owned co-op. I'm part of Means TV, and we are the only streaming service where we own the means of production. We own the content that we put out.
I'm subscribed to Means TV. Yeah, I renewed
it. It's great, isn't it?
Months ago. I really only watched like just a handful of shows, but I'm just like, you know what, this is a good idea, so I'm going to support it, even if I'm just like, I'm here for like just a handful of shows. It's like Means Morning News. I think Lance is on there in my subscription list, and there's I think Step Back History, and Crime Pays but Botany doesn't, and that's kind of like my core of, oh yeah, right, I have Means TV. I'll watch one of these from one of these creators, right? It is just like very superficial for me, but it's an idea that I like and that I believe in, and I think we need more of.
Same. Yeah, I agree with that.
And yeah, those are all, again, very good issues for me. Again, it is, in a way, I guess, kind of a gotcha, because as you point out in one of your answers, a lot of it is tied together. There is no climate justice without talking about racism and imperialism and colonialism, which means then you have to talk about workers' rights. Like it's all connected. It's all
interconnected.
Like what's that like infamous knot that Alexander just kind of cuts? It's meant to be symbolic of a whole bunch of different stuff. I want to say like a Phrygian knot, but I don't think that's correct.
I know what you're referring to, but I have no idea what the name of it is.
Yeah. One of my old English teachers is probably spinning in his maybe grave. I don't know if he's still alive because he was very old at the time. And he's just like, oh no, I taught you this. You should know this. Brah. But on those notes though, and about trans rights and what's going on in America, if it makes you feel any better, up here in Canada, we recently had a bit of good news where initially there was some bad news about several drag time story hours being canceled by a bunch of chuds who were basically a spin-off or kind of a successor group to the Freedom Convoy that absolutely just wreaked havoc across the country last year.
Yeah.
That was absolutely messed up. In the wake of that, it seems like people finally got the message of, oh, they're not stopping. This means, oh, great, we have to actually do something about this now. And so then the counter protests started happening. And this past weekend, there were 4 different events where these asshole chuds in question were absolutely outnumbered by people showing up to support the LGBTQ community.
That's great.
And there were others, before this past weekend where, again, it was just kind of seems like victory after victory for the counter protesters, including in some small towns that you would expect to be kind of more Freedom Convoy supporting because they had supported it in the past, but there were pleasant surprises in small towns, at least in Ontario. I don't know about some other corners of the country. So it has been good, large cities, small cities. It has been successfully counter-opposed, if you want to call it that, here in Canada. And without guns. So, hey!
Yeah.
That's good. But with that being said, though, one thing that I know you were doing for a while, but as you mentioned in the pre-show, it has been scrapped. You have been working and doing some research, it's probably a bit dated now, about gay rights in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's very much a blind spot for me because obviously I am Canadian and just a Westerner, so I mostly hear about stuff that's going on here in my country, next door in the States, across the pond in Turf Island, and then kind of wherever I have comrades and extended family. So bits and pieces of Europe, Latin America, and India, and Australia. And then the rest of the world is kind of this just black void of, I don't know, here be
Hmm.
dragons. I really have no idea. So I know you can't maybe give us super detailed specifics, but what did you learn about researching the ongoing movement for gay rights and just like LGBTQ liberation in the Middle East and North Africa, which unfortunately is kind of notorious for being anti-LGBTQ?
Hmm. Yeah. So, you don't really expect to see these types of social movements in developing countries just because these are what political scientists refer to as um, post material. So
Yeah.
they're post material in the sense that you don't care about civil rights or civil liberties when you don't have a roof over your head, when you're worried about war or invasions. So
Famine,
people
yeah.
Exactly. So people don't usually focus on these types of things in these countries. I mean, they exist, but to what extent, right? And so, what was interesting about, in particular, North African countries is the countries with which actually had pretty strong queer rights movements. So, Morocco, for example, historically is a really conservative country. They're a monarchy. And socially speaking, they're really, really conservative. I mean, that will vary depending on what area you go to. In more, I think, bigger cities. I'm not sure if it's still the same, but in Marrakesh, you can basically, if you're a woman, you don't have to wear a hijab. But in other areas, more conservative regions, you have to cover up. So it's a just very conservative country overall. Whereas when you look at, their neighbor, in just Tunisia, for example, I don't know if it's their direct neighbor. Yeah, because
No,
it's Morocco,
no.
Algeria,
Next is
Tunisia.
Algeria, and Morocco and Algeria are basically in an eternal blood feud with each other. So that's not going
Right,
to change
right.
anytime soon. And then next to Algeria is Tunisia.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to
I am a
visualize the.
geography and history nerd.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Because yeah, I'm trying to visualize. I'm like, wait, I'm like blending these countries together. But anyways, like it's the same region, and Tunisia socially is very different. Like they allow alcohol. You don't see a lot of women covering up. This was in Ben Ali's Tunisia, so before they democratized. And so what was weird about that is that in a really conservative country like Morocco, you saw a pretty big LGBTQ plus movement. It was called Kif Kif. It was one organization.
Hmm.
They staged events. They couldn't do traditional protests in the sense that you see in the West, but they would have like they'd light a bunch of candles, and just to make a point in the public. Whereas in Tunisia, you didn't see anything like that. So basically, my whole research goal was to figure out what the hell is going on here because in these three different countries, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, you see Morocco, a very conservative country with a large LGBTQ plus movement, and Tunisia, a pretty socially liberal, comparatively speaking, country with almost no LGBTQ plus movement. And then Algeria, kind of in between them, right? They're not as conservative as Morocco, but they're more socially conservative than Tunisia. And they kind of have like this mid-size LGBTQ plus movement. So what's going on? Like, what are the factors that is leading to this contradiction? Because logic dictates that if you are a more conservative country, you're not going to really see movements like this. In Tunisia, you'd expect to see all these types of movements, women's rights movements, LGBTQ plus rights movements, because this is a more social country. It's more secular, but you don't see that. So what's the factor? And so with my research, it all came down to internet penetration. The reason why Morocco had a larger queer movement despite being a more conservative country is because Morocco had far more internet access.
Huh.
Whereas Tunisia, they did not have as much internet access. And what access they did have to the internet under Ben Ali, they couldn't really do much. It was blocked off. They didn't have as much freedom. When they democratized, however, internet penetration increased, freedom on the internet increased, and then their LGBTQ plus movement almost caught up with Morocco. And then in Algeria, you kind of see it mid, right? They have a bit of a mixed internet penetration. It depends on the area. And so basically, my research found that depending on the level of internet penetration and freedom on the internet, that is going to directly determine how large these social movements are. And so it kind of is important because I don't think we really realize, or I think maybe we take for granted just how crucial the internet is in organizing. It's a really useful tool. And so it's not
And Twitter
necessarily like
specifically, yeah.
Twitter specifically, yeah. So it's not necessarily like these movements would be able to exist without the internet. In Morocco, they certainly could not. They would be targeted. So that was essentially the crux of my research. And that was my master's thesis. But I wanted to turn that into a book because my advisors told me that it was research that had not been done. And it was actually a contribution to political science. So I really wanted to expand that and look at other countries because there was a lot more inconsistencies that you see, not just through North Africa, but in the Middle East, more broadly speaking. In Iran, for example, they're vehemently anti-gay, but they're pro-trans. And so pro-trans that they don't accept gay men, they force them to transition. So
Geez,
it doesn't make any sense, right? So there's a lot more that I wanted to look at, but unfortunately, around the time I was doing my research, I started the Humanist Report, started doing that full time, and I kind of abandoned it. So if anybody wants to read it, it is available on ProQuest. You can cite it. It's been accessed. I get the report every single month about how many students are accessing it, and people are still reading it, which is really cool. So feel free to expand, replicate this research. I have my methodology laid out. You can apply that to other types of countries, maybe in East Asia. It would be interesting to see that. So yeah, that was kind of what I worked on, and I found it really fascinating.
Okay, and it's apparently publicly available. So there you go, folks. Go check it out and do some research.
Yeah.
And yeah, on that note, I think you said that you had studied political science before. So then that whole 2011 Arab Spring must have been just a very exciting time because based on all my friends and contacts in foreign affairs, political science, they were all just like, oh my god, we're watching history unfold. And I'm just like, yes, can we help these people, or are we just going to sit back and watch and maybe see what happens, good or bad?
Yeah. I was watching the Arab Spring unfold in college, and it was truly crazy to see. Like I was watching like the live streams of on Al Jazeera at the time. And it was, yeah, needless to say, that was something that my professor focused on a lot because I talked about the Middle East and North Africa, and my professor was a scholar of Middle East and North Africa, and she conducted some of the first public opinion polls in Libya after we decided to, quote, free Libya. And that was when, we did intervene, the United States intervened, and Gaddafi was he was taken out by the assist of the U.S. And that didn't turn out well.
No, and I mean, I have such mixed feelings about Libya. Like, yeah, I wasn't as radical left back then as I am now, but I was still left leaning, and it was just such a mixed feeling because on the one hand, yeah, Gaddafi did a lot for Libyans, but he was also very despotic and very strange in a lot of other ways. And then to see the crackdown on people just asking for more freedom and democracy as part of the wider movement, and for it to be cracked down, like, I'd be lying if I said I didn't cheer when, it seemed like at the 11th hour, the rebel stronghold of Benghazi might fall, and then, oh, nope, in come the French with their fighter jets to stop it, and the rebels get to live another day. I was like, okay, like, come on, that's Hollywood right there, and that's kind of cool. But then the problem, as I saw it, was, okay, so no fly zone. How are we going to do this? Oh, wait, nope, shit, we're just doing a Western imperialism. Oh, CIA assets on the ground. Oh, boy, okay, here we go.
It was like
are we going to have peacekeepers at the very least? It's like, nope, open air slave markets. God damn it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It's like you're right next door to the birthplace. You could have had it. God damn it. Like,
yeah. What was that Hillary said? She was like, we came, we saw, he died. About Gaddafi. It's like, holy shit. Part of the problem is, this is always a question of the devil you know versus the devil that you don't know. It's really horrifying to see a lot of news outlets spotlight a humanitarian issue and then suggest that intervention is what we need to do. because a lot of these, like, we don't understand these countries. Gaddafi was absolutely horrible. He was a brutal dictator, but now, as you said, now there's open slave markets there. And the problem is that democratization is very difficult in these types of countries because, like, unlike us, they don't really have that much of a national identity. Like, I view myself as an American, you're Canadian, and you don't have an issue like that. But in Libya, for example, like, tribal solidarity was above all. So trying to get different tribes in these countries where, they basically, the colonists drew lines straight through,
Yeah.
some of, you can't get that to really work very cohesively. You're trying to force these people into a box when they don't fit and you don't understand it. And that's not to say that I'm against democracy, but I'm saying that in order to try to construct more humane, democratic states in these countries, you have to understand them. And the borders need to reflect them and their tribes and history. It can't just be what's imposed upon them. So that's why it's like trying to turn these countries into democracies is never going to work. And I'm not necessarily like somebody who's very savvy when it comes to foreign politics, but I feel like that's just kind of a common sense position that everyone acknowledges.
No, like my general view of how I respond to that kind of notion of, oh well, no, we need to democratize. Like, quite frankly, I don't trust the people who carved up the places in the first place to be able to fix them, because
Right.
it's the direct result of that problem, or rather the series of problems. So, oh, hey, why all the conflict in Israel and Palestine? It's like, how long you got, and how and like how often am I allowed to openly diss the British Empire in the 9-hour lecture that I would have to give to explain why it is the way it is and why the British are at fault, right? Like, it's all these different aspects that are always brought up as though, oh geez, the poor buggers can't seem to help themselves. And here I am, even just with, like, I like geography, I like history. I didn't, take it in school really, but it's just always been a fun little hobby, something for me to learn more about and read about. And so for me, I just remember thinking, so we carve up Africa, the Middle East, dismantle various different empires, caliphates, etc., all for very specific European interests at the time. And then these countries are specifically set up as resource extraction. It's not about, hey, you also get a cut of the resources to benefit your nation and raise you up so that therefore it raises up our empire. It's very much white supremacist shit f***ery. And so then we're surprised, like, gee, I wonder why the Congo didn't pan out when it was basically stolen and enslaved by a Belgian king. And then at the point of it becoming independent, because the Belgians got out of their lickety-split, it had just 28 university graduates, all of them in Europe. There wasn't a single domestic university in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So, hey, here are some of the problems that are leading to the current issues because of empire and resource exploitation. And so the audacity of America, Britain, France, oh, these poor countries, they just can't help themselves. That's why we need to keep intervening or provide a steady guiding hand. I'm like, you have done enough. You have done so much more harm than good in this regard. And then unfortunately, what ends up happening for the sake of stability, and I don't know if this is still potentially being challenged or not, but the African Union seems to have a policy, last I checked, of territorial perpetuity, meaning no changed borders. I'm like, you are thus condemning half of your member states to internal conflict for God knows how long, potentially forever. Either because of resources, tribal conflicts, religious differences, because again, the Brits, French, etc. did not respect those boundaries. And it's just so deeply frustrating.
It's evident that, like, we haven't learned our lesson.
Nope.
Like, has any of these, United States, we're currently the global hegemon. Have we learned our lesson? Of course we haven't. So it's deeply frustrating because, like, who was it that said those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it? I mean, we're literally doing that. We're just repeating it. Like I feel like history is almost circular at this point, where we just keep coming around back to the same point. Even the rise of fascism again, almost 100 years later. It's all. It feels like we're living in a simulation. I don't know.
Well, so um, it's kind of funny that you talk about this, because this is something that I ended up talking about randomly with a buddy of mine at a house party years ago, and I was either high on acid or mushrooms. I can't remember.
Those are the best combos, I bet.
Yeah, and so already people are thinking, "Oh, geez, where's this going?" But I just kind of casually mentioned about circular history. It's like, I know it doesn't repeat perfectly, but it always seems like we fall into the same patterns. Mm-hmm. And this is me, like, ruminating while high and thinking about my place in the universe. And a buddy of mine just kind of casually mentions, oh, well, there's actually a couple reasons for that, or that people suspect there are reasons for that. So I'm just parroting what I remember my friend saying, but I mentioned that I was on drugs, so I may not have it 100% right. But what he said was that the general view is that because humans only live for so long, we tend to not be able to see long-term patterns and be able to fully understand them and internalize them, and then learn how to counteract them. I was like, okay, that's actually pretty good. And then he said, and then the second part of that, which maybe you could view as sort of they're like two sides of the same coin, is that it's kind of, no matter what, this same cycle, whenever there's kind of some large social change or upheaval. So it's not that history repeats so much as this is a natural pattern to be found in the universe. Not that fascism is a natural pattern, but that when it comes to civilizational change or collapse, there's always going to be stressors that result in various different problems. And he just gave some very recent examples at the time. So we pointed out how in the aftermath of the First World War, which is basically trying to just kill off the old sort of colonial world of the 1800s, it took World War I to kind of do that. But it hadn't fully finished, which is why there's that weird interwar period where, like, okay, wait, who's actually winning this? Because it was in many ways inconclusive. And then you have the Second World War, which was even more goddamn horrifying, which, wow, like, First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And then Germany said, hold my beer, I'm going to do it again in 20 years. And then finally you have the New World Order after that. That's the Cold War. And then he pointed out how we're basically seeing the same thing now, in the early 2000s, or like, I guess at that point, late 2000s, of, it's the same thing. The Soviet Union collapsed. America's kind of in this weird transitory phase. What do we do now? It's now 1992. What do? I don't know what I'm doing anymore. And so this whole period that we're seeing is, again, the shifting of the global order to something new. And that's a really horrifying thing to think of, but I was high, but I didn't have any real counterpoint or argument to that. Because then as I started learning more about history and delving further into the past, it's like, oh, wow, yeah, this is a lot of the same pattern, whether it's for workers' movements or changing power plays between different empires. You could, in many ways, attribute the kind of blood feud that the Byzantine Empire had with the Sassanid Persian Empire and how that eventually changed. And you had, like, just the explosion of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa, which fundamentally reshaped the world. And then in response to that, you had the Crusades. And, like, it's all kind of the same kind of issue of whenever there is an old dynamic that then is in the process of going the way of the dodo bird for whatever reason and however it may happen, that kind of causes the same patterns to emerge of economic stagnation. There's a power vacuum that needs to be filled by someone. Increasingly, so-and-so led the empire into ruin. Trust me, I will lead it to greatness again. So whether that's fascism, authoritarianism, various different flavors of shit, like, it's
Mhm.
kind of the same pattern because it's what happens when empires, societies, etc., kind of reach a certain point. And so I think that that's something that more people should be cognizant of, as well as the fact that, again, we're humans. We can't really understand why things bad, and then unfortunately we also tend to look at older people of, oh, what do you know, you're not me, no one understands who I am. Like, it, this is how it's been forever, right? So
Yeah.
that's just something that I do want to share with you and other people for your consideration
I
of,
like that explanation. No, that I think that makes total sense to me.
it might have been even better, but again, crucially, as the caveat, I was high, so
Well, for being high, I feel like you parroted what you heard while high much better than I ever could. So
well, I think
there's
my
that.
initial response was, whoa, oh my fucking god,
Bro.
dude. Like, I'm pretty sure that was word for word my initial response, but it stuck with me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating to me.
So yeah, that is just something that I felt somewhat relevant to share. Of, yeah, unfortunately these patterns kind of repeat, and like it's horrifying, but to me there's also a bit of comfort in it,
Hmm.
knowing, like, not so much to try and normalize it of, oh well, you know, millions of people gotta die and that's just how it is. Like, no,
Hmm.
that is so horrifying, but it's comforting to me anyway, in the sense of it makes it a bit more understandable, and then that, oh, there could potentially, depending on how we recognize this and work towards it, something better on the other side.
Hmm.
So, you
Right.
know, all the pushing against, you know, workers' rights, trans rights, it's all part of that old world dying. There's
Mm.
that quote, right? The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters, you know.
Mm.
it
Hmm.
There is something to realize of, oh yeah, so we're in that phase that is never pleasant, but it does mean that ultimately, and who knows, maybe how long, you know, a few years, a few decades, but hopefully within our lifetimes, something newer and better is on the way. So that gives me a little bit of hope for eventually tackling the climate crisis, as
Hmm.
we've seen up here in Canada, where, like, our right wingers thought, oh, hey, let's copy America and be assholes to the LGBTQ community and call drag performers a bunch of groomers. Meanwhile, we're not going to do anything about the Catholic Church. And then
Hmm.
people had to counter protest to just be like, just get a life, go home. We support our queer kids and our friends and our family members. And it has just been, like, really funny seeing the pictures. It's like 17 raging, angry, like, just goblin little white people, and then dozens to hundreds of people of all shapes, sizes, and colors waving various flags and signs, being like, hey, nope, nope, not gonna let you have this. And that's just
That's awesome.
really good to see.
Yeah, no, that's wholesome. That's heartwarming. Yeah, you love to see it.
I mean, it's unfortunate that we need to counter protest this
Yeah.
stuff, because, like, it was already settled, like, decades ago at this point, nearly 2 decades ago. I think in, like, 2005 or something, gay marriage was finally, like, fully legalized in Canada. It was a big thing at the time.
Hmm.
And, you know, oh, hey, look, the world didn't end, society didn't, you know,
Yeah.
completely backslide, God didn't send meteors to destroy us. Like, it was fine. And poll after poll shows the vast majority of Canadians support queer rights. It's like, okay, this is good, seems pretty settled. But no, because a bunch of assholes in America decided to start it, then that inspired our right wing assholes, and then now we have to counter protest that. And thankfully, it's, you know, still the same number of overwhelming support. So that is, you know, if people need good news, they can at least take that from here north of the border.
Yeah, no, that is really encouraging, and it's good to see that these people aren't really influencing public opinion in Canada or the United States, because the GOP here before our midterm election, I mean, they were going out of their way to demonize queer people, and it was supposed to be a blowout, but no, I think that there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that part of it is people just didn't buy this narrative that were like chopping off little kids' dicks. Like, who believes that? It's so preposterous. Like, if you're going to embellish and lie about a community, you have to at least try to make it somewhat believable. But they're like so out of reality with their claims, that I think that even the normies are like, that seems pretty fucking stupid. So it backfired. But one thing that does worry me is how much stupidity we're exporting to Canada.
Oh
So
yeah.
much stuff. I'm so worried about that. I feel like, even though
Ugh.
I don't like that Canada does send their right wing assholes our way, Steven Crowder comes to mind. On
Jordan
one hand,
Peterson
it's
as
like, but
well.
we did create that momentum and we exported the stupidity. So should we burden them? Like, should we carry the burden of them coming here? Like, I don't know how to approach this, because I do feel guilty that we are having such a profound impact on Canadian culture, which I've always viewed to be very wholesome, very kind, and if I'm going to
Oh,
be
oh
stereotypical,
no.
apologizing for everything.
Yeah, okay. So like, yeah, sure, some of our stereotypes are true, but like again, I'm a history buff, nerd, whatever you want to call it, and very early on, and I'm super thankful to my grade 10 history teacher for pointing out a lot of the BS, not just in the book, but generally
Mm-hmm.
within the curriculum. He was really good for that. Our version of history is very much this whitewashed lie of just eternal progress and niceness, and then also comparing and contrasting in terms of like the social aspect to America, when we had a 200-year period of slavery in this country that we do not talk about or study at all. Our ongoing mistreatment and genocide of the indigenous peoples, the just like absolute horror of that. The last residential school closed when I was 8 years old, so this ain't exactly old history. The
Mm-hmm.
infamous 60s scoop, which is, it happened a lot in the 60s, but it was a period of time from the 50s to the 70s where they just kind of went to various reserves and indigenous communities and just straight up took children. And the police, the RCMP, Dudley Do Right and all that horse shit, they were complicit in that, and then brought
Mm-hmm.
them far away to these boarding schools to be physically and sexually abused by priests and nuns, because a lot of these were run by churches, because oh yeah, it's a civilizing mission. They got to get right with God, don't you know? And hey, that cuts down on federal costs if the church is willing to do this. So it is a goddamn nightmare, and it's in recent history. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, this one event that we did 3 centuries ago. Like, no, people are alive now that were in these horrifying situations. And so every time I would go overseas or hear from someone, oh, Canadians, so polite. Oh, you're just so nice compared to America. It's like, wow, okay, so our propaganda is really fucking good, apparently, because that's what people take away from my joke of a country, as opposed to basically being another open complicit partner in the genocide of indigenous people, a happy enslaver of African
Mm-hmm.
peoples. Like, wow, okay, like, geez. We vote with America on so much stuff at the UN, as part of NATO. We have NORAD. That's the real best friends club there of,
Mm-hmm.
hey, mutual North American defense. Like, what? It's absolutely unreal, to the point that we are effectively just an American colony, and
Mm-hmm.
America doesn't even have to try to do so, because like one of the big problems is that we are a nation of 37 or so million people, and we are sitting right next to a country that is 10 times our size. So yeah, that's why we just get so much more food, media. It's like most Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, so it's where we often
Mm-hmm.
go on vacation, especially to sun-soaked beaches. Because oh hey, yeah, and like there's lots of different families that go across both sides of the border. So there's something like a million Canadians living in America, and there's like a million Americans living here in Canada. It's very fluid in some ways, right? And so, of course, just because of that, of course, we're going to listen to American music. We're going to want to go to see the big American cities. We're going to want things that America has, right? Like, that's just kind of a natural thing that's going to happen. And there's no real equivalent exchange except when one or two breakout Canadian stars manage to make it. and like Americans occasionally come up here and then realize, oh, hey, there's some good food. Oh, people are pretty nice here. And wow, our dollar goes further here. Like, yeah, okay. So there's some of that stuff, but America doesn't even have to try to have like cultural imperial hegemony up here, because all you have to do is exist and it's gonna happen. And unfortunately, that means that our right wing is going to listen to a lot of American media and take it to heart. And it's really disturbing because I've pointed this out in some of my videos. There are a lot of Canadians who seem to think that American laws apply up here. And it's the weirdest thing. Yeah.
That is weird.
Yeah. Most recently, we'll kind of go backwards in time for this. The new premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, said that, you know what, I'm going to give COVID pardons here in the province of Alberta because, they've been so mistreated, these anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers, because it's a whole freaking thing up here. Yeah.
Oh, no.
And then people had to kind of point out to her, that's not how our system works. And then she had to walk it back and say, yeah, no, sorry. The premier doesn't have the power to make pardons. And like, this is a big part of her appeal of how she became the leader of the United Conservative Party anyway. Various Freedom Convoy participants in the Freedom Convoy that like paralyzed downtown Ottawa, occupied like a major trade bridge that cost like $250 million in goods like lost each day by blockading the bridge. Which, like, actually, hey, real talk, that's how we would really force change if we just blockaded a bunch of bridges and stopped cross-border trade.
True.
The problem is that the worst people did it. But then, you know, when these people were being arrested and detained, they were saying things like, I plead the fifth. Well, what about my First Amendment rights? And then finally, one judge said the most beautiful possible response, which is, sir, the First Amendment to the Canadian Constitution is the admission of Manitoba as a province. Are you saying you're the province of Manitoba?
That's brilliant.
Yeah, but like, this is a problem where you have a bunch of people thinking, yeah, no, you know, just good. This is about, you know, freedom of speech. It's our First Amendment rights. And like, no, wow. I plead the fifth. It's like, you're thinking of American laws. This is Canada. Sir, we have a different set of laws.
I don't know if that's better or worse than the Americans who are constitutionally illiterate. Like the worst example that I have is when I worked in retail, there was this lady that was cursing out my coworker, and my coworker was like, if you don't stop, you're going to have to leave. And this lady said, I can say whatever I want. It's called freedom of speech. And then, I swear to God, she said, Fifth Amendment, bitch. She dropped the Fifth Amendment. She said freedom of speech, Fifth Amendment, bitch. Like, she thought she had the mic drop. And at that moment, I'm like, oh my God. Like, I didn't correct her because I felt like she might literally kill me and kill both of us. But it just America, stood out. So yeah. It's actually statistically possible. But, you know, it stood out to me because it's like, how are you going to be so confident in asserting that you have the right in this private business to curse us out and then say Fifth Amendment? Like, you don't even have your amendments right, lady. How? So I don't know if that's worse than the Canadians like, First Amendment, bitch, because at least they got it right. Like, their heart was in the right place or in the correct spot when it comes to, like, what they think their right should be but aren't. Where do these people come from? I mean, Jesus Christ. They're from a different world, I feel like.
No, they're just from our backyards, from our next door neighbors. It's unfortunate. And yeah, that's a particularly harrowing story of just like Fifth Amendment, bitch. And like, you know, yeah, hey, you have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom of consequences. It's why you are punished if you yell fire in a crowded place. It's why if you say, oh, there's a bomb in my bag, you're not entitled to just kind of walk away scot-free by the TSA in an airport, you know? Like, there are consequences. There are reasonable limits. Like, hell, the earliest part of, like... So one of the big problems here in Canada is that a lot of people view or think of as our Constitution is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is a big part of our Constitution, but it is not our Constitution. So a lot of people take that as like our big thing, because that's where it says a bunch of the stuff like you have freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. So it's like that sounds like the Constitution. I'm like, no, it's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Our Constitution is an archaic document handed down in 1781 by an outdated monarch. So, there's a lot of like our Constitution that is basically ripped from Britain and is based purely on precedents, and it's not actually a written rule anywhere, hence the term unwritten Constitution. It's a whole mess. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people take that kind of similar idea from our Charter of Rights and Freedoms with like the American whatever it is, I don't think it's the Declaration of Independence where all these come from. I think they are just like a separate different amendments to the Constitution.
Oh, like the Bill of Rights.
That's it. Not the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. There we go. Thank you. It's late for me.
They think that's their Bill of Rights, basically.
Yeah, and so they think that it's like, oh, well, it must just be the same. And it's, no, kids, it's not. And because of when and how these happened, it's why they're actually quite different in some regards, to the point that ours, which again was only passed in 1982, basically says very early on, by the way, terms and conditions apply. So, yeah, sure, you have freedom of speech, but we have hate speech laws. You have freedom of movement, you can't trespass. Like there's various different clear limits, and yet a lot of these people seem to think, oh, well, no, it means I can just be an asshole free of consequence. And like that, I think, is one of the worst things that has come to the forefront from, America, Canada, certain elements in Britain, is this whole kind of hyper individualist attitude of, well, if you don't like it, tough cookies. It's like, we're supposed to be a society, so you're not always going to like things, but you have to try and find common ground and work towards things. And then we added democracy to complicate that even further, it's so much more complicated than all these people seem to think. And I don't know how we potentially fix it, but you're the guy who actually went to university for this stuff. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on maybe addressing some of these. So whether it's like fixing our democracy or how do we combat misinformation, I'd love to know what like someone who's kind of studied this actually thinks.
Well, that's
2 hours later, and
it's I think that the solutions themselves are pretty simple. To fix democracy, you expand suffrage universally, you change our electoral institutions so we don't have a system that's dominated by two parties. There are things that you can do that will actually change, make the difference needed to change. The problem is that there's a lack of political will, and the system, at least in the United States, I can speak for Canada, it's, I don't want to say that we're too far gone and we're just too corrupt at this point to even make a difference, but it kind of feels like it's getting there, to where our system is incapable of meeting the basic needs of its citizens because of how many politicians are so beholden to large multinational corporations. And this isn't just like conjecture. This has been studied. There's a 2014 Princeton University study published by Drs. Gillens and Page, and it proved what we all saw, basically, that when it comes to business interests and elites, when you look at the policies that get passed, they're the ones influencing every single thing. What they want becomes law. Whereas when you look at what average citizens want, we have a 0% impact, literally statistically insignificant. So what we want does not get passed. So we're reaching this point.
Yay.
It's beautiful, isn't it? We're reaching this point where I don't know if things can change, to where I don't know if any amount of fighting or activism can change it. I mean, if you just imagine this scenario where everyone binds together and we all unite for a cause that would really get the government to buckle. I mean, wouldn't that have been the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, which went global? But our government did fuck all. They couldn't care less. And even when Democrats got in power, they did nothing to meet the needs.
In fact, they funded
the
police more.
They funded the police. So we're at this point where I don't necessarily know if any one action, even as a collective, can create that that dam burst that we need? I genuinely don't know, and I don't want to sound overly doomer, but we're to the point where I think that maybe the only thing that might catalyze change is a literal collapse of some sort, be it economic collapse, democratic collapse here in the United States, possibly something of that nature, a general strike, perhaps, because that brings the economy to a halt. But there's just not the union power to really organize that in 2023, although hopefully that'll change. So we're to the point where I don't know what the answer is, honestly, because the system itself it's like stagnation is built into the institutions. Like our constitution was designed so that way change can't occur rapidly. But if change occurs not at all and it remains stagnant for too long and the institutions lose legitimacy, Supreme Court being one example, and people just don't respect the authority of the country because the institutions are all corrupt and politicians aren't corrupt, then I feel like the system collapses, and that's where you're going to see change. The problem is that when I say that, I think a lot of lefties get excited and they say, "Ooh, yeah, revolution! I want the U.S. to collapse because that means fuck this capitalist hellscape." Except I always like to bring it back to reality and remind them where we're closer in terms of like socialist revolution versus a fascist revolution. If there were to be a democratic collapse, it's not like Bernie Sanders would rise up as the new fucking prime minister in our new parliamentarian system. It's going to be an authoritarian fascistic regime. So even to see this or envision this situation hypothetically where I see change happen, I can't imagine substantial enough change happening without a collapse, and the change would be negative. So I'm kind of at this point where I genuinely am all out of answers because I know what's needed to be done. I know what policies, what institutional designs could be implemented to further enhance our democracy. But if those things don't get implemented, then what do you do? How do you get them implemented if nothing works? And so I genuinely am at this point where I have no idea.
Okay, fascinating.
Stopping fascism is my number one goal, essentially, because it's like, okay, if I can't get the policies that I want codified into law, if Medicare for all isn't going to happen in my lifetime, maybe it will. But what can I actually control? And I can control the rise of fascism, at least now, before it's too late. I feel like we haven't passed the Rubicon yet. But systemic change, I'm not optimistic, and I hate to say that. I don't want people to be doomer. I don't want to discourage activism or political participation, but it's bad. It's really bad right now.
Well, it is a bad scene. I mean, look at what we talked about earlier, and me paraphrasing what my friend was saying about collapse of one order to be replaced by something hopefully preferably better, but that's never a guarantee. One thing I would I guess caution against is sure, we can recognize the systemic changes needed, but how do we accomplish it? It's a whole massive machine that's fighting against us, but I do know that there are places and organizations that are fighting that are also scaring the establishment. One of the first episodes of the show in season 1 was interviewing Nakia Wallace of Detroit Will Breathe, which is one of the few and radically successful groups to come out of the Black Lives Matter movement. They successfully got an injunction against the police. They sued them. They won. But of course they had to suffer a lot of like actual conflict with the police in order to do that. Up here in Canada, there are groups in some major cities. In the nation's capital, there's Horizon Ottawa that has caused a bit of a stir by, oh, wait, an actual grassroots movement. Another organization that kind of just came out of the Freedom Convoy for at least a bit. I don't know if they're still active or not. Was Community Solidarity Ottawa, I think. Mm-hmm. And they were the ones that started organizing actual real counter protests against the convoy. And then the crucial Battle of Billings Bridge that like absolutely scared the shit out of the far right. And one thing that I will also say just in terms of a broader thing is that one thing that I always notice, and like we never learn our lesson as leftists from this, is that we always end up reacting to stuff, we're never really proactive.
That's a great point.
It's always, wait, no, surely we aren't going to do this thing, right? It's like, surely the driver of this bus is not going to actually do what I think he's doing and drive us off this cliff. Surely that's not going to happen, right? And then you're mid-air going off the cliff and realizing, oh my God, he did it. Okay, well, all right, brace for impact. And then after the impact, it's like, okay, who's alive? Who knows first aid? Yeah, okay, all right, let's start dealing with the aftermath. And I find that that's what the left often does. And case in point, with the recent, we're protesting drag story hour up here, it was, again, they kind of had some early victories, and then people realized, oh God, I guess we have to protest this. And then that actually galvanized your average Canadian against it. So it's kind of like, hey, right now here in Ontario, our public healthcare system is being openly, brazenly dismantled by the Conservative government. And it's like, this isn't, and I just know in my heart that this isn't actually going to be fixed or stopped until enough people start getting problems to realize, wait, what? No, unacceptable. And then they're going to demand of whatever the next government, whether it's Conservative or Liberal or maybe even New Democrat, who knows, they will demand, you must do the thing, and then that might finally galvanize it. But it's not going to happen now, when really right now we should all just be knocking on their doors, because we know where they work, we know where they live, and we should be in front of their doors with bricks being like, hey, how, hands off my healthcare and I'll drop the brick. Like, that's what it should be like. But no, instead it's just, oh, come on, no, sure. Well, you know what? Maybe it won't be so bad. I'm too busy. I got so much work to do. And then it's going to be, 5 years from now. What? They're charging for this now? Unacceptable. Revolution time. And then that's when it's going to happen. That I find is unfortunately the issue with the left. So
yeah,
like,
you're right about that.
I would say that in terms of some kind of hope in the dark time is if and or when America becomes a fascist autocracy, that is when you will see people be like, oh my God, what? No, that's it. We must rise up. And in a way, we can already see this in what happened in Portland during the height of the BLM protests in 2020 and 2021, where suddenly Trump, to try and send a message, had like the black site vans start showing up and pulling people off the street. And that galvanized more people to show up in the streets of Portland. That brought out the suburban moms and dads of like, not in my America. I didn't care before, but the fact that you could just take my kid, little Jimmy Jr., to a black site, no. And so I was like, okay, I mean, we have work to do with you, but at least you're out in the street right now, and that's scaring the fascists. So unfortunately, I think that is going to be the next logical step for America, is if Trump comes back or DeSantis gets in, or God fucking forbid it's Marjorie Taylor Greene as Empress Supreme of the United States. And it's just, yeah, no, that's it. We're outlawing the pedophiles, which means we're outlawing the Democratic Party, and everyone must go to church, and we're going to kick out all these other people, and we're going to have National Kill a Queer Day. And like, when that happens, that's you're going to have people being like, oh, okay, so revolution time, you have chosen. Okay. That's when you're actually going to see stuff like that happen, which again, unfortunate that it has to get to that point. And that also means that people are going to die, because you're going to have fascist militias, especially in America, because of your whole Second Amendment thing. So that's going to be absolutely horrifying, and that's going to be a bloodbath. But again, to like kind of, air quotes, have some hope about this situation, is that when it comes down to like the absolute darkest hour is when you will see people start to rise up. It happened in Ottawa with the Freedom Convoy. It happened in Portland with BLM. It happened also ultimately with the civil rights era with like all the different crackdowns because, oh no, that's technically illegal. You shouldn't be in these places, and you shouldn't be on the front of the bus, and you shouldn't be having walkthroughs through these very nice white neighborhoods. And then the images of the riots, which again were condemned by media of the time, of like, oh, MLK's peaceful riot. Look how they treat their own neighborhoods. Gosh darn it, like it was that same bullshit line. But it brought enough of an attention to people to realize, wow, that's actually pretty inhumane. Maybe, Martin Luther King and these guys have a point. I mean, I'm still not comfortable with it. After all, I am a racist white person in the 60s. But, they kind of are making some points. And I'm looking at this and thinking, oh, geez, that is kind of harsh. Like, it had to get really bad before it started to get better. Again, not saying it's perfect now. We all know it's not. But that's kind of, again, that sort of repeating pattern of it's always got to get worse before it gets better. And as one system begins to die, whether it's for a nation, an economic model, a social movement, a social class, or a structure or hierarchy, there's always going to be some kind of conflict that then finally switches it to the new order. That's just kind of how it is, unfortunately.
Yeah. To bring it back to that whole the conversation with your friend about how things change, the new order. I think that's really fascinating. There's a caveat to my doomerism. So my doomer analysis is exclusively macro. And so I don't want to leave people with this sense of hopelessness, because I do want people to understand that on the micro level, there are things that you can do that actually do make a difference. Like in terms of influencing the US government, I have no idea. But if you were able to organize your workplace, support local efforts to unionize, that right there is the hopium that I get. To see unionization efforts and how successful they've been, that does give me a lot of encouragement to see. So local politics is very, very important, and making a difference at your state, at the state level, or in Canada, perhaps the province level, although not necessarily the best comparison. But like at the state level, at least here, it's easier to make a difference. It's easy, or I shouldn't say it's easy, but it's doable if you wanted a ballot initiative in certain states to get signatures and try to form coalitions with your community to knock on doors and stuff. So you can make a difference on the local level, even at the state level. But nationally, it's very, very difficult. But that's not to say that it won't happen. So that's what I'll leave people with. Just don't let the doom and gloom of the current situation encourage you to not do anything. Because once you've given up, then I kind of feel like you've surrendered, right? But if you have a how do I want to frame this? If you have like a sober look at the situation and you acknowledge the political realities, then that's when you can realize, okay, these are the small things that I can do. From there, I can do this, I can do that. And you can't do any of this shit alone. That's like number one. This is about reaching out, forming a community, meeting people in your neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's really
it's all
important.
About community.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, that's what gets things accomplished. Like none of us can get anything done if we're just molding and doom scrolling on the internet. But if you really do feel hopeless, then trust me, just meeting people in your community does make a difference. Reaching out with like-minded people, it does make a difference. Like even a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, I went to a town hall for my member of Congress, my representative, and just like somebody afterwards approached me and was like, hey, you seem to be really interested in this. I remember I asked about like her sponsoring a bill to support ranked choice voting. And so, she came up to me and she was like, yeah, what do you think about this? We should meet up and try to see if other people agree with this. Like sometimes people come to you, so that's one thing that I want to leave a lot of people with, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be doom and gloom. You might not be able to control the entirety of the situation, but there are changes that you can make as an individual that will better at least your surrounding areas in your community.
Oh, absolutely. And that, like, I know I'm no longer doing the daily content because instead I'm involved with this charity now. And so that's taken up a lot more of my free time. But one of the things that I've found is again, just, working with other people, like-minded individuals who understand, oh, hey, we got to clean the air to meaningfully get over this pandemic. So how do we do that? Or one of the groups on Facebook that I'm a part of is all about just kind of like little acts of showing love and support in your community. So it's sometimes as simple as, friendly neighborhood barbecue, or, helping a neighbor move the stuff and then he repaid me with this, or we all got together to help this other neighbor. Like it's like actual good stuff, and not the kind of like fake optimism of, oh, this little girl is running a lemonade stand to raise money for her mom's cancer payment. It's like,
Yeah.
it's not that. It's more like, here's us actually like showing up in the community. My local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of Canada are on a push right now to help educate people, especially tenants, for knowing their rights and how to form a tenants union.
Mm.
I myself am, again, with everything going on, I'm one of the few leftists who's not proficient in firearms, but like I know how to use them and safely. And so, like, oh, hey, yeah, come for a range day, get you a little more acquainted with guns, which is actually much harder to do here in Canada because a lot of people here are very much anti-gun just entirely. And so I'm one of the few, like, left-wingers up here who has guns. They're nothing special. It's a hunting gun and then one for, like, the range and just plinking, but... yeah.
But I thought they were banned in Canada.
Well, many are. The AR-15s are, and they're probably going to ban even more very soon, which is still just really frustrating and upsetting. I'm probably going to make a video on it. And yeah, that's a subject for a different time. Like, there's no real good option here in Canada for firearm rights, except for the Canadian Socialist Rifle Association, which is very much a new organization, and it exists again because basically they and others like us have taken a look around and realized, so we have ignorant, super scared liberals who are just completely anti-gun, and we have crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but very much like super pro-gun, wannabe American conservatives up here, and it's like there's no in between, which is just so deeply unfortunate as a socialist and anarchist to just be like, so my options are very grim. And so it's like there's this niche that hopefully will be filled soon. And so just all these little different things that I hear from people in various different, like on Discord servers, from the Facebook group, going and volunteering for stuff with friends. It's all these different little things that are, what, people are still good, and ultimately we still want the good things in life, right? Like, we want to help our neighbors, including if they're just total strangers. We recognize the good and value of humanity, and we want to work towards that in whatever small or meaningful ways we can. Then you see that other people doing that, and that kind of gives me a little bit of hope for some kind of revolution or positive change in the future. It makes me feel less alone because I'm not the only one who believes in this stuff, and I'm not the only one trying to work towards these various different goals. And there's all different kinds of organizations, some who know each other, some who don't. We all want the same thing, which again is part of why I started this show of just, hey, let's bring on different kinds of people. Like, so long as you're basically social democrat and left, you're, with few exceptions, you're welcome on this show, right? Because ultimately we recognize the current system is failing. We want better, and we know it's possible.
Yeah, beautifully put. And I think that you said it best when you said, like, these things make you feel less alone. And that does wonders, right? Because we're all kind of isolated, especially since COVID. We're all in our own little bubbles. And it can really feel depressing and demoralizing to feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But when you kind of venture outside of the internet and you, as the kids say nowadays, touch grass, it really does remind you that everyone else is experiencing the same world that you're experiencing, feeling the same things that you're experiencing. And a lot of people really are good and just pleasant. And even if they aren't pleasant, like, you don't have to be like the assholes around you, right? Like, for me, like, I have this belief, validated by empirical evidence, that Americans really are the stereotype. Like, they're dumb, annoying, loud, and ignorant, but a lot of them have good hearts, and you can change their minds. And to the extent that you can still change minds, I think that you should try to do that. But it's not just something that can be done by arguing with your family member on Facebook. Like, getting to know these people and building a sense of community and building relationships, they're much more susceptible to hearing you out politically if you do that, as opposed to just coming at them. And so that's what I'll try to like instill in my viewers. Although it's hard to not be completely doomer and just tell everyone, "This is it, it's done, we're all dying." No, I wouldn't say that. But like, it's hard to not get into that mindset, right? Because things are so bad and people are so isolated. But I always try to bring it back to, again, you can do things, you can make a difference, but locally. And it doesn't feel like that's satisfactory in a sense, because when you think about like political change, I think about like systemic change, changing our electoral institutions, getting Medicare for all, and we can't get that right now currently. But the difference that you can make in your community, even if it is much more smaller, it still does matter. And believe it or not, it will make you feel good. So, small things that you can do, just even a small act of kindness for someone, that does make a difference, because you're helping out somebody in your community. You made a concrete, tangible difference to their material well-being. If you just like hand somebody $20 who's sitting on the street, and you might not be able to do that every single day, but to the extent that you can help someone out in any way, I think that also makes a difference. It doesn't have to be explicitly political. So just like, don't be a dick and try to help people. That's kind of like my lesson that I try to instill in everyone every single day. And I remind myself of that too, because sometimes I can be a dick.
Hi, Bother Brigade. Thank you once again for tuning into yet another episode of Progressive Profiles. I had a lot of fun doing this one. I hope you also had fun listening and watching. I hope you learned something. If so, what was your favorite thing that you learned? Please let us know in the comments down below. And please check out Mike Figueredo's work, both in terms of his actual written work and also his channel, The Humanist Report, and links to all his socials will be in the description down below. And once again, I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon for supporting me and this content. It really isn't possible without them for a variety of reasons, but I want to give an especially large shout out to Jean-Luc Desroches, Jennifer Randall, Bother69, Patrick Mansuri, and Mark Joycey for your incredible support at like the highest tiers. That's wild to me. A lot of, history is wild to me, which is kind of what we ended up talking about. A lot of the same patterns of history and how they not necessarily repeat, but definitely rhyme. And we just don't seem to ever notice it, despite giving all this evidence by the universe. And it's just so deeply frustrating. I think that's what's bothering me today.